Well, good morning, everybody. As you walk through the shops at Christmas, you often pass a nativity scene, don't you? You know the one I'm talking about, where Mary and Joseph, the shepherds and the wise men, they're all standing around this baby, looking at him adoringly. And as you're doing your mad dash to Woolies, and you take a quick glance at this scene and your eyes center in on this child at the center, who is it that you see? Who is that baby in the manger? Okay, well, I'm sure you'd all tell me it's Jesus then. We all know that. But who is Jesus? Because this morning, I don't want us just to take a quick glance. I want us to stop and stare and contemplate and think about who is this baby in the manger and what has he come to do? Because I think no matter who you are here this morning, whether you're someone who's exploring Christianity, whether you've been walking with the Lord for 80 years, I think we can all have too small a view of who Jesus is. I mean, how can we ever possibly exhaust all that Jesus is? So this morning, I wanted to stretch us to think deeply about these two questions. Who is the baby in the manger? And what has he come to do? So our first question, who is the baby in the manger? Well, I guess I've already spilled the beans, right? It's Jesus. But what has this baby come to do? Paul starts to answer this question for us in verse 15, where we pick it up. He says, the Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. Paul makes two huge claims about who Jesus is. Firstly, that he's the image of the invisible God. And secondly, that he's the firstborn over all creation. You know, I think it's obvious to all of us, isn't it, that God is invisible. If I told you or asked you to show me where God is, you wouldn't be able to, would you? Yet Paul makes an astonishing claim about Jesus. He says that Jesus is the image of God. In other words, in Jesus, God becomes visible to us. And the reason this is the case is because of verse 19. Later in our passage, we read that God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him. Jesus is the image of the invisible God because Jesus is fully God. As we look at Jesus, he's not 50% man and 50% God. He's not 70-30 God-man. No, he's 100% God. All of God's fullness dwelt in him. And yet at the same time, he's 100% human. And I'm going to let the mathematicians in the room wrestle with that. But we can know God because Jesus has revealed him. Because Jesus is fully God. But Paul also says that he's the firstborn over all creation. The concept of firstborn doesn't really exist today. But that said, my twin sister, she was born just 2 minutes before me, would really like it to. And she loves to tell me that she's the oldest at every possible occasion. I'm sure if you're younger, you know my experience. But unlike today, in biblical times, it was the firstborn who got a double portion of their father's inheritance. They might receive a special blessing. You might think of how Jacob got the blessing from Isaac. They would have a position of leadership within the family, might even have a seat of honor at the table. To be firstborn was a title of authority and supremacy within the family. But for Jesus, he has this title of authority and supremacy, not over a family, but over all creation. Now, just to be clear, when it says here that the Son is the firstborn over creation, it's not saying that God the Son was created. There are many who have wrongly thought that. In our passage, we're going to see that it's through Jesus that all things were created and through the Son, and the Son was before all things. So clearly he's not created. No, Paul is signaling to us that the Son's authority over all creation. This title of firstborn, we're meant to see that the Son has authority over all creation. And the reason he has this title of authority is because of what follows. We see that all things have been created through him. Pick it up with me in verse 16. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him. Do you see the Son as creator? Because that's what Paul is saying here. In the Son, all things were created. You know, the language Paul uses is so all-encompassing, isn't it? Whether it's in heaven or on earth, or all the powers that contain within them, the Father has created absolutely everything through the Son. I mean, just think about that for a moment. No matter whether it's the angels in the heavenly realms or all humanity here on earth, everything was created through the Son. Everything you see around you, from that smallest cell under a microscope to the most distant star in our galaxy and everything in between, has all been created through the Son. And that means as we see God speaking creation into existence all the way back in Genesis, we can understand that it was through the Son that the Father was creating all things. But not only were all things created through the Son, all creation is for him as well. Now, I don't think there's many people who are actually arrogant enough to think that the whole world revolves around them. But there's probably many of you, and I'm included, that like to think my life is all about me. I'm at the center of my own world. I'm the main character in my story. But that's not what this passage says. It says that it's all for Jesus. Whether it's the stars in the sky or the flowers in the field, your family dog, or maybe for the Smiths, your family chickens, you and I, we are all for Jesus. See, the point of creation and existence itself is for Jesus, because it's all for him. And Paul doesn't stop there. He keeps going. In verse 17, he says, he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Everything in the whole world, the whole creation, is sustained by Jesus and held together by him. It's like when someone's in hospital and they're really unwell and they can no longer breathe. They're placed on a ventilator, and the ventilator breathes for them, sustaining their whole body cells with all the oxygen they need. But if that ventilator was to fail, that person would die, because the person's completely dependent on it to sustain their body, right? Well, in a similar way, Paul is saying that the Son is our ventilator. He's the one that allows our lungs to fill with oxygen, for our hearts to beat, for our cells in our bodies to do what they need to do. And not only does he sustain us, but he sustains the whole universe. Everything is being sustained and held together by him. If you like, the Son is the ventilator of the universe. But we also see that Jesus has authority and supremacy in the new creation as well. That's going to come up on the screen, verse 18, follow along. And he is the head of the body of the church. He's the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have supremacy. There's a lot packed into that verse, but I want us to hone in on that title, firstborn from among the dead. What does it mean? Well, we know in a literal sense, Jesus is the firstborn from among the dead, isn't he? He's the first one who was resurrected eternally, never to die again. And so like before how Jesus, the Son had the title of authority, so it is here too. Just how Jesus has authority and supremacy over creation, because all creation was made through him, is for him and sustained by him, so too Jesus has authority over the new creation, because he's the first to reign eternally. And for that reason, he has supremacy over the church as its head. And so Paul is at pains in this first section of our passage just to paint a big picture of Jesus, to show them that in all things, in every possible way, whether it's this creation or the new creation, Jesus is supreme. After looking at this, how would you answer the question I asked at the start? Who is the baby in the manger? Because I think we can all have too small a view of who Jesus is. I mean, just Think about this, and it's really incredible. Try to wrap your head around it. As Mary looks at the baby Jesus, as she holds him in her arms, she's looking at God. Because Jesus is the image of the invisible God. The baby who lies in the trough of hay is the one through whom all the galaxies came to be. It's the one that it's all for and sustained by. Can you comprehend that because Jesus is fully human, he was dependent on his parents just like any newborn is today? He needed them to feed him. He needed them to change him. Yet at the exact same time, he's upholding the universe and sustaining every cell in every organism. As he lies in the crib, not able to walk or talk, not even able to roll as babies do, even at that moment, he's keeping the orbits in spinning. He's keeping the world turning. Isn't that incredible? And he was doing that even while he was in Mary's womb. Try and wrap your head around that. As you look at the baby in the manger, is your picture of him too small? As you look at that baby, do you see Jesus, the Son of God, who has supremacy over everything? So since this is who Jesus is, what do you think is the right way to respond to him? Since this is who Jesus is, what do you think is the right way to respond to him? Because I think too often we have this too small a view of Jesus, and that leads to a too small a response or a minimized response. Do you treat Jesus just like a life coach? Someone you can go to get good advice and counsel to achieve your life's goals and ambitions? Because ultimately it's about Jesus getting on board with your agenda, because you're at the center and not him. Do you treat Jesus like a genie or a magic charm, someone you go to when you need something? Lord, if you help me get this job promotion, I promise I'll go to church on Sunday. Is Jesus just an insurance policy that you took out when you're 20 that now sits in the filing cabinet until you need it? Just sitting there, not really doing anything. Do you treat Jesus like a calculated risk? Lord, I'm willing to go this far for you, but once it gets a bit hard, or once I have to change my lifestyle, well, that's where I draw the line, because surely Jesus doesn't want me to be like one of those radical people, right? But as we ask the question, who is the baby in the manger? Who is Jesus? We are given a big answer that he is Lord of all, supreme over everything. And so our response should be to submit every aspect of our lives to his lordship. So are there parts of your life that Jesus isn't Lord over? That Jesus isn't at the center of? Maybe it's home life. Maybe it's work or school. Maybe it's how you're using your retirement. Would your bank balance declare that Jesus is Lord? Maybe another way of asking the same question is, if your life was described as a house, are there certain rooms in that house that are off limits to Jesus? Jesus can come into the lounge room, but not the kitchen. Can I encourage us all just to be captivated by how big and supreme Christ is, and to let that shape and dictate our lives? So we've answered our first question, who is the baby in the manger? And we've been given a big answer that it's Jesus who is supreme over everything. And so that brings us to our second question, what has Jesus come to do? What has Jesus come to do? Well, Paul says in verse 19 that he's come to reconcile all things. Pick it up with me in verse 19. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. Do you notice the cosmic scope of Jesus' reconciliation? See, that verse does not say that just Christians are reconciled. It says all things, whether in heaven and on earth. And so a passage like this can be tricky because as we read it, it can raise questions like, does that mean everybody's saved? What about someone who doesn't trust in Jesus? Well, the answer is no, and Paul will make that explicitly clear in verse 23. But what Paul means here by everything being reconciled is that since sin entered the world in Genesis 3, there's been a disorder to the world as humanity and evil spiritual forces rebel and reject against God. Yet at the cross, through Jesus, God defeated his enemies. He pacified them. He brought them under Christ's rule, therefore bringing peace. A bit later on in Colossians, in chapter 2, verse 15, Paul says this about Jesus, and having disarmed the powers and authorities, he made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them by the cross. Jesus won the victory on the cross. Because there on the cross, sin and death were defeated. There on the cross, all the powers and authorities that oppose God were defeated. So why did Jesus come? He came to die in order that through him, all things in heaven and on earth might be reconciled, whether willingly or unwillingly. But Paul now shifts from talking about this cosmic reconciliation, and he wants to remind the Christians at Colossae personally about what Jesus' death on the cross meant for them in regards to their reconciliation. In verse 21, he says, once you were alienated from God and were enemies in your minds because of your evil behavior, but now he has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death to present you holy in his sight, without blemish and free from accusation. See, Paul starts by reminding them and us of who we were. And friends, it was a bleak picture. We were alienated from God, estranged from him, cut off like maybe from a family or a friend. We were his enemies. And Paul says this is who we were because of our evil behavior, because of our sin. In other words, we brought this on our own heads. We're the ones that slammed the door in God's face. We're the ones that stormed off. And I think that's really hard for us to understand. Because when we face conflict with friends or work colleagues or family, very rarely, if never, is only one person ever responsible, right? Both parties contribute to the conflict. That's why we say it takes two to tango. But we can't translate that earthly experience and paste it onto our relationship with God. Our alienation is squarely because of our own behavior. We're 100% responsible. God is 100% perfect, blameless, holy, pure. And whilst that might be a really hard thing to accept and understand, it's really important because the more we can understand that, the more we can see just a little bit more the extravagant love and grace that was poured out for us through Jesus. Because despite that fact that it was us who were responsible, God in his great love for us, not wanting us to be enemies or alienated, reconciled us by Christ's physical body through death. Why has Jesus come? He's come so that through his death on the cross, he might deal with our sin once and for all, paying the full penalty that our sins deserve in order to present us holy, without blemish, and free from accusation. Take a moment to reflect. How do you think God sees you? If I was having a conversation with God and I said, can you describe such and such spiritual life? How would they describe you? How would God describe you? Well, this passage tells us how God sees you. So let me tell you how he sees you. He doesn't see you as defiled or disgusting or dirty, but as holy in his sight. He sees you as someone without blemish, that is to say, without sin. Not because you don't sin, but because Jesus has paid the price of your sin fully on the cross. You've been washed, you've been cleansed, you're as white as snow. And because of your sin is dealt with on the cross through Jesus, you are free from accusation. Is that how you described yourself? Is that how you described how God sees you? But sadly, I think too often, that's not how we describe ourselves. I think instead of being free from accusation, we hear Satan's accusations and our own accusations going over and over again in our minds, telling us about things that we've done in the past. We feel the shame, we feel the guilt. We feel like the worst of sinners. What if they knew about? Fill in the blank for yourself. And after a while, letting these accusations play through our mind like a broken record, we start to change how we see ourselves. The narrative we tell ourselves is that we're defiled and blemished and dirty. But friends, that is who we were, and it's not who we are now. To see yourself that way is to see yourself as if the cross never happened, or the cross only had a little impact for you. But that's not what this passage tells us. It doesn't say that the cross only had a little impact. This passage tells us that the cross has radically altered who you are. You are no longer alienated, an enemy, blemished, unholy, dirty, but holy, without blemish, and free from accusation. Friends, when we hear Satan either screaming these accusations in our ear or whispering them late at night, we need to remember that's who we were and not who we are now. Keep looking to the cross where everything was changed. One of the church reformers, Martin Luther, I think, has a really good quote that sums up this point. It's up on the screen. He says this: "So when the devil throws your sins in your face and declares that you deserve death and hell, tell him this: I admit that I deserve death and hell. What of it? For I know the one who suffered and made satisfaction on my behalf. His name is Jesus Christ, Son of God, and where he is, I shall be also. Holy, without blemish, and free from accusation is who you are. But there is a condition to this. Paul in verse 23 says, this is who you are if you continue in your faith, established and firm, and do not move from the hope held out in the gospel. The church at Colossae, they were at risk of looking for spiritual fullness outside of Jesus, to treat Jesus as if he wasn't enough. Jesus might fill them up 80%, but now they need to top up the last 20 with special festivals like new moon celebrations. And so Paul has been at pains to paint a big picture of Jesus, showing them that in Jesus is the fullness of God, and in Jesus they've been fully reconciled. So to go anywhere else is less. What they are looking for in these other things, they already have in Jesus. And because it's only in Jesus that we can have spiritual fullness, being fully reconciled to God, Paul wants them to hold firm to Jesus, to hold firm in their faith, in their trust to him, to not shift from the gospel they received. They are to be rooted and steadfast. Because if they let go, they will lose everything. Are there things in your life that make you tempted to let go of Jesus? Are there ways in your life that you're trying to find some sort of spiritual fullness outside of him? Then hear Paul's warning. In Christ you have fullness, so hold firm to him. This conditional clause isn't meant to make us anxious. It's not meant to make us go, oh my goodness, do I have enough faith? Can I be saved? Paul isn't saying that since you've been saved, you now need to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. No, he's saying to continue to stand firm in what you've already received. Hold firm in Jesus. Don't move to a different gospel. Friends, sadly, this is my last time preaching before you. Although Jono said I'm welcome back, but we'll see. I have no idea what the future has in store for you guys. For some of you, life will be easy. For others, it's just going to be one crisis after another. The work crisis, the family crisis, the health crisis. And for some of you, you're there now. And so this morning, I want to share this passage to remind you and point you again to Jesus, to see just how marvelous and huge Jesus is, even in the manger. I want to stretch you to have a bigger view of him so that you might shrug off any spiritual apathy you have and just live fully for him, submitting your whole life to him. I want to remind you guys of the incredible news of why Jesus came. That Jesus stepped in this world and went to the cross for you, to reconcile you back to God. I want you to remember who you are and not who you were. That you are holy, without blemish, and free from accusation. I want to remind you that in Jesus you have spiritual fullness because all the fullness dwelt in Jesus in bodily form. In Jesus, the fullness of God dwelt. In Jesus, you have full reconciliation with God. So hold firm. Hold firm to the gospel you received. Hold firm to Jesus. Because when Em and I come back to visit, that's what we want to see. We want to see a church that's holding to Jesus and not moving. And friends, when doubts around faith come in your minds, don't bury them. Talk to your brothers and sisters here. Reach out to Em and I. We're always happy to chat. But if there's one last thing that I can say to you guys, it's hold firm. Do not shift. The fullness of God is in Jesus, and you have been fully reconciled. Don't go anywhere else.